Well, now it's time for our newspaper review, where Sally and I look at the stories making headlines around the world. First, to the European edition of the Wall Street Journal, and news that top Irish officials expect their country will need international assistance to help solve its financial difficulties. The head of Ireland's central bank, Patrick Honohan, says the country will need tens of billions in international loans. His comments come as a team from the International Monetary Fund arrived in Dublin to examine the country's books. And a very apt photograph with the story, a homeless man asking for money from that delegation in Dublin. Proof that at least one person in Ireland is definitely asking for IMF help.
To the front page of El País now, and a warning from the Spanish Prime Minister José Luis Zapatero that the country's austerity reforms are here to stay. Speaking before Congress, Mr. Zapatero said his country's economic recovery was too weak for his socialist government to do anything about its belt-tightening measures.
The Financial Times has the story that Airbus will seek full financial compensation from the British engine maker Rolls-Royce for the extra costs of distributions resulting from the failure of an engine installed on a Qantas A380 Super Jumbo. Airbus says it could face extra financial pressures in transporting replacement engines from its production lines to carriers such as Qantas.
The lead story in the Times now, and Russia has joined China in boycotting next month's Nobel Peace Prize ceremony. Jailed Chinese dissident Liu Xiaobo is due to be honoured at the event. The Nobel Committee has responded to the move by threatening to withhold its award for the first time in 70 years. China has refused to allow any member of Mr. Liu's family to accept the award in person.
And finally, they were once a Soviet symbol used to illustrate capitalism, but it seems cigars are back on the rise in Russia. Imports of handmade cigars fell by nearly half last year, but it's expected that figures will return to pre-crisis levels in 2012. As an object once featured in Soviet propaganda and the hallmark of the evil Western capitalist, luxury cigars are now popular among wealthy Russians looking for exotic ways to spend their cash. Well, to discuss cigars and much more, Sally and I are joined by Bundeep Rangar from IndusView. Thank you very much for coming in to speak to us. Well, of course, we have to start with Ireland and the difficulties facing there. You picked out the Wall Street Journal for us to have a look at in particular.
Well, it's such a change, right? Because you've got this country that was a shining example of growth, all the analogies of Celtic tiger and a shining emerald. But the reality is that I think it's just completely overexposed themselves in the real estate sector, and in two markets that have fundamentally gone down, the Irish market and the US market. And this is now a bailout not of the economy, but really the banking sector. Britain has to worry a lot here because we've got not only a direct exposure, but a lot of our banks that got nationalized, like the RBS, have indirect exposure in there. So when Cameron says, look, we've got to help if we can, it's because we have to. There's no choice in the matter.
And not only the British banking sector, but again, this is again that threat of contagion in the banking sector, possibly another global crisis in terms of bank lending.
Absolutely, and you're looking at about 60 to 100 billion euros coming from a combination of Europe and the IMF bailout, and actually Britain will probably participate even though it's not part of the Eurozone.
It's a great picture as well. If you can just have a look at that picture. We were speculating that if that the chap from the International Monetary Fund does give the beggar some money, what terms will he want it back?
Let's lower corporate tax for one, because Ireland's benefited from a 12.5% corporate tax, and this is going to be a chance for Germany and France to say, look, you've stolen away corporate head offices away from us. Yeah, we'll give you the money, but here's the price you're going to pay in terms of making the competitive landscape a little bit more level. To Ireland's advantage, or to its credit rather, 4.4 million people trying to create a sustainable economy to compete with Germany and France is just not possible. You've got to create tax incentives, and that's going to be the big trade-off. You know, how much of their sovereignty will they give up in an economic sense for this bailout? I guess one other way to look at it is Britain has more exports to Ireland than all the BRIC countries combined. We've heard that Cameron said that in Parliament just a couple of days ago. Is that the right thing, given the fact that you've got 2 billion people across the BRIC countries growing at 9% on average, versus Ireland that today has 4.4 million people and not growing? This is actually time to reset our priorities and say, let's go where the growth is and not focus on the legacy of the banking system in the past.
Absolutely. And again, moving on though, again, we've got Ireland, which as you say is a very small country, but we've got Spain, which is a very large country as well, which again is at risk from that domino effect.
Absolutely. And we talked in the past in this program about the so-called pigs, right? Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. And you're now seeing Greece getting bailed out and Ireland getting bailed out on similar terms. I guess the problem with Spain is the high unemployment rate. And they have to have the reform reforms there, but in the Eurozone, a 20% unemployment rate is the highest, and Spain can't have any more super tough austerity measures because that's going to have political ramifications. So they have to ease in the transformation and the reforms at the same time. They can't let up on them, because if they don't, the 20% is going to rise even further.
Where does it stop? Because as Sally's earlier guest was saying, Belgium is looking problematic as well. I mean, where do we end this?
You know, I guess part of this is looking at Europe in sort of a two-gear economy. You've got the southern European economies that are kind of slowing down and sputtering, and then you've got Germany, where business confidence is rising, and in some ways the euro and the ECB is becoming a de facto German/German-French economic powerhouse. So I guess where it stops is where you see one set of Europe helping and getting the other side of Europe out of trouble.
It should have stopped really if it had a fiscal policy for the whole of the Eurozone. But
yeah,
again, that's not going to happen, is it?
And it's super tough to control economic growth through one central interest rate when you've got different growth rates in different economies, different countries.
Well, let's have a look at the Financial Times, because Rolls-Royce could have to pay out a lot if Airbus is successful in seeking full compensation for those engines that have not been working. And of course, this stems from the Qantas A380, which had to make an emergency landing at Singapore earlier this month. So what happens next for a company like Rolls-Royce? This is incredibly damaging.
Some horrific pictures, if you saw. There was parts of the engine that came off and blew through the wing, which could have been much more dangerous and much more consequential. I guess 30 planes being recalled and replaced is terrible news for Rolls-Royce and great news for GE, which is going to benefit because they're the other makers of engines. And Qantas wants to keep its spotless record of having no crashes since it started. Compensation is going to be an expensive one here for Rolls-Royce, because you've got not only direct damage for this one, but all the claims they made for their engines to be super fit in order to be part of the new Airbus, and that's going to be punitive.
I think what's interesting is the fact that this conversation is happening in public, because as I understand it, this conversation would normally happen in private. And there's a quote in the article. It says, it's probably symptomatic of the fact that they're upset, referring to Qantas, which I think is probably the understatement of the year, isn't it?
Tell me about it. A bit upset. You had 417 people on board, and their safety was at hazard there. So absolutely.
And Rolls-Royce shares went down last week, but Rolls-Royce was at pains to stress that it was a resilient company. Are we in some ways going to see almost another BP in the making?
No, I don't. That's probably a bit of a stretch, because I believe that whatever has happened is contained. Whereas with the problem with BPs, we just had no idea. It was so far under the water that you couldn't really tell how far the damage was and when it was going to end. At least here we've got 30 engines being replaced, and Rolls-Royce has acknowledged a problem. Now it's a question of fixing it. And at the end of the day, they're a world-class company. They'll come out of this, seeing some ground to Boeing in the meanwhile, to GE in the meanwhile, of course.
And the Times now, moving on, Russia is joining China. Russia among a number of countries joining China in the boycott of the Nobel Peace Prize. Of course, this is the ceremony when Liu Xiaobo will be honoured, but China requesting countries to abstain. The fact that Russia is showing its allegiance, worrying once again.
You know, when I grew up in India as a kid, we always looked at the Nobel Prize being as this international award that was apolitical, kind of like the Olympic Games. And in my lifetime, in our lifetimes, we've seen both those things get very, very politicized. I believe that the coalition of the countries around this, China, Russia, Cuba, you've got, you know, more than China stating here, is deeply politicizing what otherwise should be a very merit-based award. And that's really dangerous, because in the past we've never had countries make political statements that have in a forum such as this. But it does point to the fact that the last time this happened was during the time of Nazi Germany, and therefore you've got a comparison in your face about the authoritarianism in the two regimes that's there in the world today. It's
interesting as well that the Nobel Committee is also in some ways being political by saying, well, we may not have the ceremony.
It's like the Olympic Games, we may not have them. They've got to, otherwise I think they've lost ground to China in that round if they completely cancel it.
And just briefly, I want to bring this in, because staying with Russia, but boycotting the Nobel Peace Awards, but they are enjoying cigars, and I know you enjoy a cigar as well. This is in the Moscow Times.
You can't not enjoy mojitos and cigars if you're in Cuba. It just kind of comes with the territory. But it is a sign of the times of, you know, luxury and a good time. And frankly, the Russian stock market is one of the most advanced stock price this year, so maybe there's a reason to celebrate.
Why do you think cigars are in some ways such a symbol of this?
It's the ultimate classic, you know, kind of symbol of luxury and high-end taste, I suppose, goes with caviar and all the rest of it.
Bundeep, Rangar from IndusView, we'd love to talk more, but from you, that's it. From me, Kasia Madeira, that's it. And
see you later then. Bye-bye.